in our struggle for decolonization, I feel that a lot of people, one of the ways to physically experience imperial innocence is silence, and to say, it's nothing about me, it's Putin, it's all others. I will just, sit through silently through this war, and then just people will forget and will return to the status quo. And that also is an expression of Russian imperial innocence, because I think you can overcome this innocence by joining us. And this is what I was dreaming of since 2022, and it's something that didn't really happen yet. I wonder how many years will pass when we will have the departure from innocence to activists, to people who actually say, okay, let's end this innocence, let's educate people, let's change the narrative, let's do something about it, let's get into the dialogue. And I think this kind of being silent, just disappearing, is also an expression of Russian imperial innocence.
For centuries, Russia has hidden its dark imperialistic side behind a facade of romantic myths. Myths that painted as a victim, a liberator, a misunderstood missionary. But what if the truth is simpler? Gamajoba, I'm Maksym Eristavi, a Ukrainian Czech journalist and author of award-winning Russian Colonialism 101 guidebook. In it, I list 48 Russian invasions of their neighbors in the last 111 years alone. Despite targeting very different and distant communities, Russians would follow the same formula: gaslight, invade, exterminate. And Russian civilizational greatness has been, and still is, the excuse to colonize. The stories you heard opening this talk are coming from audio shows produced by the Volya Hub, our pioneering storytelling movement. It's a global push to help communities shaped by Russian colonialism reclaim their stories. Think journalism meets education, meets audience science, meets art, and all of it but aimed at busting imperial myths. The Hub fuels books, podcasts, video explainers, and newsletters, and its flagship social media campaign, Russian Colonialism, has racked up over 350 million digital views. So it's not just content, it's reshaping the global conversation. But Volya Hub didn't start as a strategy. It actually started with a crushing personal realization that most of the craft I'd learned over 18 years in journalism was wrong. It was misguided. That the storytelling I spent a career mastering wasn't serving my audience right. It wasn't serving my people or bringing justice any closer. And a few weeks before the full-scale invasion, I felt frustrated, anxious, and lost, and foreigners called what was coming unprecedented. But anyone who understood Russia knew better. This has happened before to so many people and so many places, from Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Kazakhs, and Georgians. Moreover, even after a decade of researching myself Russian imperialism, I didn't know how to make the world really listen. Foreign editors would laugh at the term Russian colonialism, many foreign academics would dismiss it in my face, and my journalism training, well, it taught me that historical context just plainly kills attention. And moreover, as a Ukrainian, I'm too biased to not too objective to talk about it anyway. Then suddenly, just days before the full-scale invasion genocide, I started this thread on X. It is a simple list, all Russian invasions of sovereign nations over the last 111 years, following one formula and one playbook excusing the imperial violence. This thread and the connected hashtag Russian colonialism went viral and launched the Volya Hub's global mission as it stands today. And a few months after the genocide began, we launched this illustrated Russian Colonialism 101 guidebook. Then came the video explainers, the newsletters, and podcasts, and one by one, the international projects also followed. So what happened? What led me to this most important breakthrough in my storytelling journey? I got advice actually from the past, and tonight I'd like to share it with you. The first advice came from Mikhail Semenko. Aim at reason through emotion. In his 20s, Semenko rebooted Ukrainian literature. He gave it one of the boldest, wildest makeovers in its entire history. His pan-futurist art movement took aim at the Ukrainian inferiority complex, a mindset shaped by centuries of Russian colonial rule. And he mocked it very publicly and brilliantly. And Semenko actually insisted that Ukrainian culture wasn't just part of European culture. He actually believed it could revolutionize it. Semenko's pan-futurism preached a radical reimagining of storytelling, where journalism, art, and fiction collide to tell the story better, where facts alone aren't enough, and to open your audience's mind, you must first open their heart. Build an empathy bridge. So here's, for example, a spread from Semenko's magazine, Nova Generacija, where reporting sat side by side with art. And there's a spread from Russian Colonialism 101, where an illustration by prominent Ukrainian wartime artists accompany each factual encyclopedia-like chapters. So we use the same approach in combining digital collages by Ukrainian visual artists and educational journalism in our Volya Hub Basics explainers. They would tell the story in a visual way about colonialism and decolonization. The second advice came from two other giants of Ukraine's avant-garde. Two Jewish Ukrainians, a fearless writer, journalist Raya Troenker, and visual artist Marco Epstein. So they both helped carve out a Ukrainian identity that is proudly inclusive, radically diverse, and boldly anti-colonial. Marco Epstein fused Jewish and Ukrainian folk traditions with modernist fire and cubist form. And the empire absolutely hated him for it. Two cultures of defiance and survival woven into one art, and still in the face of Moscow's colonial grip, Epstein lit the fuse for Yiddish cultural revival in a newly independent Ukraine. It happened after centuries of Russian anti-Semitic rule. And Raya Troenker wrote poetry unlike any other Ukrainian artist, powerfully feminist, boldly anti-patriarchal, and deeply, deeply sensual. She was also a trailblazing storyteller in a male-dominated world of early 20th century journalism. So after centuries of this toxic patriarchy under Russian colonialism, Troenker reclaimed her body, her story, her independence, out loud and without apologies. And in doing so, she embodied what it means to be a modern-day Ukrainian. Epstein and Troenker taught me this: knowing your roots isn't a weakness. Decolonizing your voice doesn't mean losing objectivity. It means reclaiming your story from the grip of imperial propaganda. And that's not bias. That's power. That's storytelling that actually connects with your audience. And it's why we created Ukrainian Spaces, a raw, honest, and rebellious celebration of Ukrainian identity. And people around the world really felt it. The show became 100% crowdfunded and cracked the top 20 podcasts in 20 plus countries, like from Estonia and Latvia to Kazakhstan and Singapore. And here's an opener for one of our latest seasons.
It took me over 6 months to finish the last episode of our podcast. Was it the burnout? Was it the lack of energy that came with it? Or maybe the full emotional atrophy that took over my body as we entered the third year of this brutal full-scale invasion? Whatever it was, gathering thoughts felt almost impossible. Did I even have anything left to say? Was anything I was saying even helping? I'd constantly think to myself. Traveling between London and Ukraine meant that I felt stuck in the in-between, uprooted and indecisive, and this permeated all parts of my life. I knew that I had to pick myself back up, but I also knew that it would take time. Day by day, the realization that we were in this for the long run set in. It no longer felt like we were living through a turning point in our history, but more like on another page from a thick book about centuries of Russian colonial oppression of Ukraine. Perhaps the exhaustion meant that pessimism would win over on most days, but it is precisely that pessimism that would eventually force me to break the cycle of wilting that I was in. Where do we go next? What do we do now? Who do we turn to? I wanted to ask Stas, Marichka, and Maksym. This is the last episode of our special season of Ukrainian Spaces, a podcast elevating diverse Ukrainian voices and explaining Ukraine to the world.
So the last advice tonight I'd like to share comes from Mike Johansson, a legend of Ukraine's executed Renaissance, a generation wiped out by the Russian colonial empire in the late 1930s. Mike was a weirdo in the best possible way. He was hilarious, wild, experimental, a polyglot genius once he reportedly learned Serbian in a single night. And he was obsessed with linguistic diversity. Because part of the colonialism triumph isn't just rewriting your identity, it's cutting you off the world. And language domination is one of the effective imperial ways to do it. So Mike taught me this: if you want to outsmart the empire and all of its propaganda muscle, the language of your storytelling better be sharp as hell and build strong cross-border bridges. These are Johansson's 6 rules for crafting a story written back in 1928. Start with plan, but let creativity lead. Mix genres, shift perspectives, avoid complexity. Play with language, puns, surprises, wordplays. Let ideas flow. A structure obviously helps, but don't get trapped by it. Use dynamic and unexpected associations, for example, random words or concepts to spark new ideas for your audience. And lastly, capture spontaneity. Value creativity that comes from free-flowing ideas and associations. When we writing our audio show, Matryoshka of Lies, Mike Johansson's words stared right back at me, pinned above my desk like a manifesto. Be spontaneous, blend genres, let the story flow, ditch the highbrow noise. Got it. So here's an opener for one of our episodes of Matryoshka of Lies.
Imagine a sweltering summer day. A small cottage house surrounded by trees, encircled by farmland as far as you can see. In that bucolic setting, a man works on what will become another of his global bestsellers. In his writing, he creates a universe powered up by profound humanist philosophy. He paints vivid pictures of peasant life, rooting for the oppressed. He's laser-focused on social justice, condemning the cruelty and exploitation of regular people, the same kind that surrounds him on this very farm. And this new novel, criticizing any wars and placing hope in the inherent goodness of humanity, will definitely fascinate people around the world for generations to come. Now suddenly the writer is interrupted by the estate manager. He came complaining to his boss, who is not only a writer but also a colonial landlord. The farm is massive, 20% larger than the size of Manhattan, but after this land was stolen from local indigenous people, environmental ruin sets in. Ancient knowledge about how to nurture it is lost, and new settler colonists make things only worse. The ginormous farm, bought from the advance on the very same book that the writer is trying to finish, is bleeding money. The writer/colonial landlord is frustrated. In his fantasies, he was bringing progress to these primitive lands, offering peasant settler colonists a better life by leasing the farm and introducing to civilization naive indigenous people, innocent children of nature who need protection. So why doesn't it work? The time is late 19th century, the place is the land of the Bashkort people stolen by Russia, and the writer/colonial landlord is Leo Tolstoy.
So feel your audience's vibe, build an empathy bridge, don't talk over them, learn from them, never ever patronize. That was the heartbeat of Ukraine's modernists, and it's the fire behind everything we do at Volya Hub 2. To us, every story is actually a lab, a chance to learn, a data-rich treasure trove showing us how to meet our audiences on their terms and in their language. And I channeled this into building the production circle at Volya Hub as well. It's kind of very decolonized shape. As you can see here, every hour story is designed based on data, and then it gets field tested in each project, and the results alter the strategy. And all of this forms never-ending feedback loop that helps our stories to stay audience-anchored and escape elitist or colonial tropes. And we package this knowledge into guidebooks as well on decolonized storytelling. We created them for our Volya Hub partners. They were born from the exact same decolonizing ethos that Ukrainian modernists believed in. So what do we do with all of it as storytellers? Look, like every colonizer does it. They steal your memories. They rewrite your history. I didn't even know the names of Semenko, Troyenker, Epstein, or Johansson until my late 30s. Russians kidnapped, tortured, and executed Semenko in 1937, dumping his body into a massive mass grave in a Kiev neighborhood. A few days later, they dumped Johansson's body in the same pit. Between 1937 and 1941, Moscow filled the Bukivnia graves with up to 200,000 Ukrainian bodies. Then they hid the crime for several decades. No names, no markers, no exhumation possible. Raya Troyenker escaped the slaughter only to survive as part of the Soviet propaganda machine in the faraway Arctic. She died of cancer in 1945, and her grave was forever lost. And Epstein was silenced in the mid-1930s. He survived the Holocaust only to be targeted in Moscow's post-war pogrom against surviving Jewish intellectuals. This is one of my favorite Ukrainian pictures of all times. Snapped in 1925, it shows the young rebels of Lanka, a modernist literary crew that radiated brilliance. Just look at them. So young, so sharp, so unapologetically cool. Even now, 100 years later, this image still vibrates with style and with genius, but also with a future they were never allowed to live. Within a decade, the Russian occupation machine erased all of them. 3 executed, 2 were sent to slave camps, 1 silenced into oblivion. And before every project we launched at Volya Hub, I take a moment to look at this photo. To remember that our stories must drag impunity into the light. The executed Renaissance cut down in their 20s and 30s. Today, another generation of brilliant Ukrainians in their 30s is being hunted by Russia. Same playbook, still no accountability. Have you heard about any of these Ukrainian names I shared with you today? And if not, please ask yourself why. Moscow doesn't just invade, it erases and exterminates. It kills the artists, silences the storytellers. And the space left behind gets flooded with great Russian culture, because when you silence people's stories, it becomes easier to erase their otherness. Easier to convince them they're too small, too primitive, too broken to rule themselves. That's why we must educate about, share, and celebrate indigenous voices in our storytelling, especially those silenced by Russian colonial terror. Because it's not niche, it's not boring history, it's empowering, it's public service as storytellers and journalists we have, and ultimately it's resistance. So I will end with a quote from one of the last interviews by Maksym Eristavi, a Ukrainian writer murdered by Russian invaders in 2024. He said, "I find joy in crafting short stories about people, especially if they manage to go through all of this. As strange as it may seem, in today's context, the greatest achievement seems to be simply surviving. In this war, each person carries a unique, extraordinary story. They're filled with distinct sounds, voices, and dreams. So, for example, some have spent their lives building a house, others became shift managers at poultry farms, some cherished reading thick books, while others collected fallen leaves and chestnuts. A person, to me, is a story." So Volya Hub doesn't receive institutional funding. We run it entirely as a volunteer effort. And our mission inspires you, if it inspired any of you. And if you vibe with it, here's how you can support us. So partner with us to franchise our video explainers and the audio show Matryoshka of Lies. We wanted to bring in other languages and other countries, or book us as creative and audience producers to consult your newsroom. We help make audiences care about complex, painful topics like imperialism and colonialism and traumatic histories. Support Ukrainian wartime journalism, art, and publishing. But above all, please help Ukraine win. Thank you. If you have any questions, we still have some time to answer them, so please, happy to answer. Just raise the hand and volunteers will help you with the mic. Yeah, it's fine. It's always takes time to process a bit.
Hi, Mark Mullen,
Hi, Mark.
founding member of the Global War Party. Thank you. I live in Spain, and my question has to do with the attitude, particularly there, but in sort of Southern and Western Europe, where for them, there's an inaccurate understanding that Russia is far away and that this war doesn't have a whole lot to do with them. And that's even more so in Latin America and East Asia, for example. You know, for someone who lived in Georgia for a long time, when I hear you talk about this, I understand the meaning of 1937. I have an understanding of all of this and what you're talking about, but there are places that don't. They think of colonialism differently, and part of what you're doing is to try and get them to think of colonialism in the Russian context. And could you talk a little bit about talking to audiences that are not used to thinking of colonialism as something that Russia does?
Yeah, I think part of the success of specifically Russian imperial propaganda is, to cement and instill that notion that colonialism or imperialism is only what Western countries did overseas to people of color, and that's only their experience with colonialism is the only one existing. And I thought so too for most of my life as well, and I thought that it's just a Western thing and it happened to faraway places. But when I started learning these stories, not only from the place I come from, but places like Georgia, Kazakhstan, places like Ireland, for example, I started realizing that, okay, maybe there's something much bigger behind it. And unfortunately, when you learn more and research more, not only you understand that Russian Empire basically replicated all the same modus operandi with a Western, cosplayed from Western colonialism, it also did overseeing colonization in Alaska, in Africa. So it tried all of it. But in a way, it successfully presented in the last few generations as someone who has nothing to do with it. And they would go abroad and tell these stories and play anti-colonial champions, and they go back and home and do horrific things of colonial nature to people in places like Ukraine or Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan or North Asia. So for those people, I think part of our aim is once again to show the faces and to tell individual stories. And when you hear those stories, you understand that those people look very differently. They come from very different cultures, different part of the continent, different geography. There's little in common with them, but when they share their stories of surviving through colonial abuse, it's the same story. And then people start understanding that maybe it was happening also on the Russian turf. And maybe, unfortunately, colonialism is not something unique just to Westerners, but an unfortunate fixture of our history. The desire to dominate, the desire to exploit, the desire to abuse, especially if there is nothing in place left to check those desires.
Hi, my name is Andres Ilves. I'm Estonian.
Hi.
Hi.
It's like friends here.
Yes, it feels nice, and I've been waiting for something like this. And so one of the things that I spent a lot of time with and on is the Soviet-occupied Afghanistan, where they killed 1.5 million civilians. And that's not something you ever hear about, right? I mean, people talk about, the American occupation and so on, and people sort of look at the last 20 years in Afghanistan, and I discussed that with people, and I say, oh, by the way, did you know that many more times people were killed during the Soviet occupation? They say, what Soviet occupation? And I'm just curious, because I think your solution is great, your approach is great, and your identification of what needs to get out there is great. But I've spent my life talking to people who either don't understand, don't care, ignore, dismiss. You say Russian colonialism, they roll their eyes. I'm just curious, why do you think that is? Like, what's the underlying problem that there's a lack of interest and just a lack of knowledge and a lack of interest? I know what we're fighting, hopefully we'll win, but what is the origin, the base for why this problem even exists of almost active suppression and ignorance of what Russia has been doing for so long?
Thank you. That's a very loaded question. I'll try to attack it as quickly as possible. So I think in my personal experience, I also was, as I told in the show in the beginning, I was frustrated that I also not taken seriously and people do not listen. And it doesn't matter if I use this terminology or that terminology to tell the stories that need to be told. But then I think I realized quickly that it's first a problem of elitist spaces, like academia, big newsrooms, especially Western, where we talk about it on our Matryoshka of Lies show. There's an entire episode devoted to infiltration of these institutions that happened by Russian imperial propaganda for generations. And it created these like elite circles that basically believe into Russian version of our story, in Russian imperial propaganda. And basically all our history, our experiences were told for generations through the prism of either Russians or Westerners who never spoke a single, never met a single person from Ukraine or North Asia and think that just knowing one imperial language, Russian, is enough for them to be huge experts and explain everyone else to the rest of the world. So the infiltration is a big part of it. And second of all, I think I feel still hopeful because now we have so many opportunities to bring the stories in different light and center once again, people in it. So other people can connect through personal stories at first. Because we can disagree on the terminology, we can disagree on certainly politics. The society is hyper-polarized and partially because of the Russian imperial propaganda. But when we expose ourselves to these stories, when I expose myself to these stories, I kind of can reconnect and see similarities. And it's very hard because lots of these stories are erased on industrial scale, even as I stand here. Ukrainians are being murdered in mass, and the stories that, for example, Maksym Eristavi is not able to tell anymore just because he was killed by Russians. But these stories need to be told, and I think eventuality they will tip the point where people will start, and they already start speaking about what is happening in right language, allowing people who actually have intimate experiences with it to be open experts about it and not dismiss them saying, oh, you're too biased. You cannot tell that story because, I don't know, your house has been bombed. So eventually you're automatically eliminated as a person with an opinion and expertise on it. That's just, you're a hysterical barbarian who wants to vent their Russophobia, whatever. Yes.
Hi, Sam. I wanted to ask a practical question because I think it's really impressive what you did in terms of the process of growing this project. Just from what I see, it looks like it kind of started from the germ of a viral tweet, and then you expanded from there. It's really impressive, and I'm wondering if you, because it was on X, which is also huge in terms of spreading misinformation and Russian propaganda. I'm wondering, do you have, I guess, tips or strategies for how to live in that ecology of how to get viral or or how to, especially with you have such a nuanced story that you're trying to tell with imperialism. So do you have any tips on how to do that?
Well, look, I have a probably personal tip because I'm a very prolific blocker of accounts. That's true story. I have like 25,000 blocked accounts on X. And it helps me, of course, to a bit deal with it with organized campaigns and an onslaught of authentic and non-authentic, hate and everything. But part of the reason I think why I love to be here at ZEC Festival, because there are a lot of people here talked about our horrific problem with lack of any accountability for the social media platforms. And I'm not the person who would vilify social media platforms. They helped me to build my voice, and I'm here only because of social media platforms. On the other hand, we have this very unfair competition where imperial propaganda, whether it's Russian or whether it's Iranian, and they have these massive resources to produce insane amount of content daily churning. They're just like overwhelming all of us with this. And social media platforms do zero, absolutely zero, publicly, non-publicly for years. I've been trying to work with them. And at some point they feed you the stories that they do content moderation, but then that turns out to be mostly for publicity. So I think the first major issue is to clean up the act of social media platforms. We cannot just quit social media platforms and find a public space somewhere else. Moreover, we shouldn't do that. Once again, the uniqueness of this moment for us, for people coming from the region, but for the first time in history, despite that all of that has been happening for hundreds of years, for the first time in history, we're able to connect with other people with similar stories and try to connect the dots and find, maybe learning some lessons from each other, do friendships, do the pushback, talking back at the empire together. So it brings additional power we haven't had before. On the other hand, if we do not press hard on regulations, especially where it's still possible, like European Union and somewhere else, on ensuring that they clean up their platforms from this propaganda activity, authentic, it just works in their favor. Because a part of the propaganda at the moment is not so much to convince, but to flood you with so much information that you're like, I don't know what to believe. I don't know. I don't believe the media. I don't believe these people. So I will form some my bizarre, kind of world inside my head that I think of these things. And this is just, it's not working out. So I think, that would be kind of a thing that I would privately and publicly encourage and contribute myself as well. Yes, we have the question there at the middle. Oh, sorry.
Okay, can I ask now? Katie Hutschwili, Civil Society Foundation. So my question is more political. With Trump administration now refraining from increasing aid and maybe even cutting down the assistance to Ukraine, are you thinking about special strategy to reaching out more to the American public so that they somehow pressure their government? Is it possible, and do you have any approaches to this?
I think that the entire this mission is based on the assumption that if we don't use the right language and we don't name the things the right names, and we don't call the abuse by the name of abuse, and we don't see the context and the buildup, and we're just have tunnel vision. Oh, this is like Putin's war, or how we did get rid of the Putin and everything else is going to be right. Once we don't have this and we have tunnel vision, it's impossible for you to produce a good policy decision how to deal with it. It's impossible. Even we've seen it in the years before in terms of army in Ukraine. It took very hard work on behalf of Ukrainians to not only, to bang and say that these weapons should be there, but also kind of explain why and what's at stake. And this is not just Ukrainian issue, that we're trying to prevent World War III from happening. And this is the issue of freedom and so on, and also show once again this pattern that it will keep happening if you just, deal with this issue or try to put a temporary fix on it. In 10 years, you're going to be dealing with even bigger issue, and more people will be slaughtered this way because it's a serial behavior of abuse. So I think in one way, my approach is a bit overarching, and I fight tooth and nail so people use the right language everywhere. So we do it in journalism, for example, when we consult other newsrooms, especially not from the region. If they want to cover the region right and use the proper language and decolonize their own coverage of the region, they can reach out, and then we will advise them, for example, how to craft a story, like, for example, that you need to prioritize local voices all the time, that local expertise has to lead. So it's kind of not innovative in a way to think about, just responsible storytelling, but you'd be surprised how much not present at all it is in the coverage of this, at least like the main big issue in the region, which is genocide in Ukraine. And then it goes also to policymakers when they craft even the texts of their legislation or acts and stuff like that. The way it's worded, it already sets an important precedent for coverage. It sets important precedent for how people perceive it publicly. And if you keep saying, like, I know, Putin's war, or like, let's end Putin, and not addressing the larger elephant in the room, which is Russian colonialism, imperialism, and then we need to put an end to empire first, then no good policy decision ever will come out of it. I know it's not exactly what you asked me, but I think taking that step back and very policing our language, how we describe it, does miracles in the way how our brains open up to the problem fixing that. There's one person who wanted to...
Thanks, Maksym. Can you talk a little bit about the channels and formats that you are using, and are considering using? What has worked, what hasn't, ranging from tweets to books to short videos, long videos, anything you've tried or are considering trying? Would love to hear that.
So we test different stories in different cultures, different geographies for different people. And it all depends, of course. So you need to be really flexible, kind of approaching this issue once again from decolonized point of view as a producer, to first learn more about the audience that you want to talk to. So this is a very quick response to it. But in terms of formats for complex stories, I think when we try to talk through art first, and this is what I talked about in the show. As a journalist, for me, it was very unusual to think about using art and collaborating with artists to tell a very factual, dry factual story. Or, here's the pattern I spotted. And here's like, basically, if you go through the book, it's basically encyclopedia-like. There's no narrative storytelling. There's basically facts, and they show you the pattern. But when people approach it through the art first, they open up more about hearing it rather than just words. And then mixing these genres is exceptionally important. Once again, because of informational oversaturation and people are so overloaded with text and with everything, you have to work a bit extra harder to find more eclectic mixes to tell a story. However, for me personally, it always breaks down to be super attentive to audience. So once you publish something, it doesn't matter which format or which platform it is, you plan in ahead kind of a mini campaign for yourself to get a feedback from the audience and then analyze it. What they liked, what they didn't like, what they felt was lacking, what kind of language they responded better or not. It's a bit of a marketing kind of ish approach, but it really helps you as a storyteller to be more sensitive that you do not talk over people with whatever you do, but you kind of, take a step back and they say, oh, I heard you, and this is I agree or disagree, but here's something I did better for you to connect with. So this part of the honesty is super important, and in my personal experience, produced the most viral, the most impactful stories and content. I think we are running out of time. Yeah, so just maybe one question, I'm told. So if you guys have any other questions? Don't see anyone. See? Then we're done. Thank you. I have just one last ask from you. If we spend just a minute of silence for the victims of ongoing genocide in Ukraine. So join me, please.